Hello and welcome to another episode of Cancelled Games. This time we're looking at Sony's PlayStation Vita or PS Vita, originally dubbed the Next Gen Portable, the follow-up to their hugely successful handheld, the PSP. The Vita was released in Japan in late 2011 and worldwide in early 2012. It had an emphasis on cross-platform play and interactivity, featuring cross-play with many PlayStation home console games and the ability to play PS4 games via remote play. The Vita, as with most relatively recent consoles, has a huge list of cancelled games. The Vita was released in an age rife with digital content, so this list will be a mixture of planned physical releases and download-only games. I've picked 15 of the many cancelled games for this system, but there are of course a lot more out there. So let's have a look at 15 of the games that never made it to the PS Vita. First up is Legend of Raven, a 2D fighter from Nicalis, developed by former King of Fighters devs. Originally called Yatagarasu Attack on Cataclysm at the arcade, it did see a PC release with an updated story and extra content. It was headed to the Xbox One, PS4 and of course the PS Vita as Legend of Raven. Initially the handheld port was planned for the 3DS, but fighting game fans pushed for a Vita release and Nicalis responded. Legend of Raven looks superb visually. We can clearly see hints of the SNK influence here, but the gameplay was actually heavily inspired by Street Fighter 3. Characters would have normal and special moves as well as EX specials and supers. The fighting relies on the player anticipating their opponent's next move and reacting or preempting accordingly, much like in Street Fighter 3, and uses a similar parrying mechanic which is a huge part of Street Fighter 3's gameplay. The parrying and counter system seems quite involved, making this a game that would probably suit competitive play. The PC version of Yatagarasu featured 11 playable characters, so I'd assume that the Vita version would have at least an equal number. It also featured in-game commentary, another nod to the competitive fighting game community. There was a selection of commentators to choose from, including in-game characters and notable people from the real-world fighting tournament scene. Controls would have the 4 main buttons as light punch, heavy punch, light kick and heavy kick, with the Vita's shoulder buttons performing a parry which opens up the opportunity for a counter-attack. Moves would work in exactly the same way as in the Street Fighter series, so characters have either charging special moves or the Hadouken-like circular motions. Legend of Raven certainly seems like it ticks all the boxes for a 2D fighter. Stunning graphics, really fast and fluid gameplay, and a heavy rock soundtrack with some excellent sound effects. I'm not exactly sure what happened to the console versions, it just seemed to fizzle out without much fanfare, but if it looks like something that would appeal to you, then Yatagarasu Attack on Cataclysm is available on Steam. Kodoku was a horror game planned for the PS4 and Vita in 2015 from London-based Carnivore Studio. The development team was comprised of various different nationalities, but all fans of both horror games and Japanese folklore. The game itself was an exploration horror game featuring stealth mechanics set on a Japanese island on which you're striving to locate a rare book. The island is inhabited by all sorts of bizarre creatures from Japanese folklore, and to combat them and survive you would need to utilise stealth and use magic, obtained via magic talismans that can be crafted by the player. These talismans were presumably an integral part of the gameplay, as the name Kodoku itself comes from a type of poisonous magic from Japanese folklore, which has been the central theme of several pieces of Japanese fantasy fiction over the years. The developers stated that they drew inspiration from not only Japanese folklore, but other aspects of Japanese culture, including legends and traditional dance. The available trailers don't give much away, but it certainly looked interesting. The project was eventually cancelled due to financial reasons. Another game whose trailer doesn't tell us much is Killing Bites, a fighting game heading to the PS4 and Vita, being developed by Nex Entertainment. Announced in 2015, it had a planned 2016 release date. Based on the manga/anime series of the same name, Killing Bites would see the player enter the Killing Bites fighting tournament. As I said, the trailer shown at 2015's Tokyo Game Show is more of a teaser and doesn't tell us much. Considering the source material, I believe this may have been a Japanese exclusive. Nex initially delayed the release of Killing Bites, stating that they needed to work on the game's quality, particularly the multiplayer side, but it was subsequently cancelled altogether. Warrior's Lair, also known by its working title Ruin, was a fantasy action RPG being co-developed for the PS3 and Vita by Sony and Idle Minds, who developed some Cool Borders and Ratchet & Clank games, and also developed the ragdoll catapult-a-thon Pain for the PS3. Played from a top-down isometric viewpoint, it looks like your typical action RPG, but a good one. The graphics and lighting look superb, and the gameplay enjoyable. One could easily make comparisons to Diablo. Warrior's Lair was in development very early on for the Vita. It was first shown by Sony at 2011's E3, where they first showed the console. It was even used to demonstrate the feature whereby owners of the game could swap between the PS3 and Vita versions mid-game, continuing where they left off on the other console. This cross-play feature is commonplace nowadays, but certainly wasn't in 2011. It was even rumoured that the games would be available as a bundle containing both the PS3 and PS Vita versions. Another interesting feature would be the social play, allowing players to trade items and chat, and create their own lairs which would hold valuable items. These lairs would appear as quest markers for other online players, so perhaps that would have been a significant part of the game considering its title. Sony obviously had a reasonable amount of faith in the game, even taking pre-orders, but the Vita didn't release until 2013, and sometime between these dates they obviously lost faith in Warrior's Lair, announcing its cancellation in 2013 before the Vita's launch. Idle Minds had spent a year developing Warrior's Lair, with Sony reportedly investing millions. Even the developers at Idle Minds were in the dark regarding the true reason for its cancellation, and several possible causes have been speculated, including the release of Diablo 3 on Sony's consoles being a factor. The Chainsaw Incident was another 2D fighter, being co-developed by Crazy Piranha Entertainment and Origo Games for the PS4 and Vita. From what I can find, it seems that Crazy Piranha was mainly an animation studio, created in 2005 with the aim of, quote, introducing the world of animation in the Middle East, equivalent to the major animation companies worldwide. The English here doesn't exactly make things clear, but I assume they were based in the Middle East and wanted to take their animation worldwide. The Chainsaw Incident was a versus fighter that they intended to develop and launched a Kickstarter campaign in 2014. The Kickstarter page showed some short pre-alpha demo footage which was advertised as an early build, with the disclaimer that the final project would be far more polished. They also promised that the final release would feature a 14 character roster. The playable characters all referenced or were inspired by something from horror stories, films and heavy metal music. The plot takes place in a world called Nevermore, which has come under some sort of dark plague infesting everything and everyone with chainsaws. Okay then. The pre-alpha footage shows two characters, Massacre, a huge dude with an equally large chainsaw, and Milder, some sort of hideous monster ragdoll hybrid embedded with chainsaw blades. The developers said that each character would have multiple movesets, allowing the player to select the moves which best suit their playstyle, be it offensive or defensive, and even had stretch goals to add even more movesets to each character. The controls would consist of 5 buttons, light, medium and heavy attacks, and then gas and clutch buttons. The gas, shown as a meter at the bottom of the screen, would allow players to chain combos, although the devs stated it would be of limited use, which seems odd for a feature that warrants its own on-screen meter. The clutch button would balance chain combos and cancel or enhance special attacks. Of course, each character had their own respective super moves and a unique Mortal Kombat-like finishing move that could be executed at the end of a match. Crazy Piranha and Origo stated that the chainsaw incident was to be a PlayStation exclusive, at least at first. They also hadn't ruled out a PS3 version of the game after the initial PS4 and Vita versions, depending on demand, and said a PC port was also possible down the line. As you can see from the Kickstarter project page, the chainsaw incident received nowhere near the funding it needed, bringing in less than 10% of its $275,000 target, so it was cancelled due to lack of funding. City Shrouded in Shadow was an action survival game from Granzella and Bandai Namco, heading to PS4 and PS Vita. The PS4 version was released in 2017 as a Japanese exclusive titled City of Giant Shadows. Both titles allude to the game's main theme: giant creatures are attacking the city. There are plenty of nods to classic Japanese media, including Godzilla and several other Godzilla universe characters like Mothra and several Ultraman characters. You take on the role of an office worker, either male or female, trying to navigate the disaster-stricken city and survive a mysterious attack from these monsters. You also witness a Yakuza deal that you weren't supposed to see, so also have to contend with a pursuing hitman while dealing with the monster attacks. Early discussions for the concept considered the player controlling a journalist, taking pictures in a town hit by disaster. Whether this was a similar monster-themed disaster or something more domestic, I don't know, but at some point the monster themes became the focus. This initial concept makes more sense when you consider that City Shrouded in Shadow was a spiritual successor to Disaster Report, renamed SOS The Final Escape in PAL Territories, a PS2 disaster game starring a journalist who investigates the cause of the disaster. For a PS4 game, the trailer footage doesn't look up to par visually, and the released PS4 version, although an improvement, didn't wow me graphically either. After 3 years of development, the project was shifted to a PS4 only title, as it was easier to work on improving the game's quality if they only had one platform to worry about. DiscStorm was an arena combat game developed by a small UK based studio, XMPT Games, published by Mastertronic. It was headed to PC and the PS Vita. The game started as a bit of a hobby project, with all 4 of the dev team working full-time elsewhere and working on DiscStorm in their free time. The gameplay involves throwing frisbees at enemies, which bounce off surfaces, creating a web of ricocheting discs. There's a single player story mode with numerous bosses, but the real focus was on the multiplayer, which offers several gameplay modes. The developers wanted to emulate the pace and atmosphere of classic multiplayer games like Bomberman, but with a modern twist. It has a great aesthetic, blending pixel art and cartoony graphics, as well as featuring chiptunes and modern electronic music. So in those respects, I think they really nailed the old meets new theme. Of course, the PS Vita version never came, but if you fancy throwing a few discs, then DiscStorm is available on Steam. Drive 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 was a driving game from Different Cloth and Choice Publishing, heading to the PS4 and Vita. The very short trailer states that it was a driving game about racing multiple tracks at the same time. I think how this worked was you were racing is several races at the same time and had to switch between which car you were controlling at any given time. While you were controlling the car in one race, the computer AI would take over the control of the other races. The developers called this AI artificial idiocy, as the computer AI was so poor at driving and was powered by what they called their stupidity engine. So switching between races as often as possible would be essential to winning each race. They also promised a synthwave soundtrack, a track editor, several different gameplay modes and varying atmospheric conditions including gravity. I'm not sure what happened to the game, but it's a very strange concept indeed. Dungeon Defenders is described by its developer Trendy Entertainment as an online tower defense action role-playing game. It was originally released for mobile platforms in 2010, with subsequent PS3, Xbox Live Arcade and PC releases. A PS Vita port was also in the works, but was eventually scrapped. As their rather wordy description of the game suggests, Dungeon Defenders blends tower defense with action RPG elements. You take control of apprentice warriors from 4 base game character classes, for example wizards or knights, taking on all manner of hideous fantastical creatures including goblins, orcs and ogres. 1 to 4 players would team up online to take on these hordes of enemies, with the levels consisting of around 5 waves and some then featuring a boss battle after the last wave has been defeated. The main gist of the gameplay was to defend magical crystals from these attacking swarms of creatures by using the skills, traps and weaponry available to your chosen character, as well as building and maintaining defensive towers. The Vita version, which was to feature cross-platform play with the PS3 version, was abandoned in favour of other projects. Square Enix brought Final Fantasy Agito to mobile devices in 2014 and were planning a PS Vita version of the game called Final Fantasy Agito Plus, which was demoed at the 2014 Tokyo Game Show. Set during a period of war, the story has the player create a cadet who will eventually become the fabled Agito, the person destined to save the land. The RPG gameplay typical to the Final Fantasy series features turn-based combat and focused not only on the single player campaign but on multiplayer combat. The campaign was designed to be played several times over on the character's quest to realising their true destiny as the Agito. Your cadet could be customised from the outset, with you selecting their gender, appearance and weapons. The game would be centred around the cadet's progression, with the story revolving around a magical academy at which they are a student. The cadet's bedroom within the academy would serve as a central hub for the game and its missions, and the cadet would progress in rank by taking on missions, side quests and by interacting with teachers and other students met in and around the academy's campus. This interaction with NPCs not only progressed the cadet's standing within the academy, but would forge bonds and relationships that would affect the story in the late game. These conversations as well as missions would also result in the accumulation of new equipment, weapons and magical spells. Final Fantasy Agito used your device's clock to manipulate several in-game elements. For example, it would change the day and night cycle to match the real world time of day, and different NPC interactions and missions would be available depending on the day of the week. Final Fantasy Agito was released in May of 2014, but the servers only remained active until November 2015, so it's likely that this was a factor in the cancellation of the Vita version. The Hero Trap was headed to the PS Vita via a March 2014 Kickstarter campaign by developer Smashworks. This was quite unique to see an original Vita game as a Kickstarter's focus, rather than the Vita port being an afterthought or eventual stretch goal. Described by the campaign as a roguelike dungeon crawler, it featured some nicely drawn top-down 2D visuals and gameplay inspired by the Gauntlet series. In the game you take on the role of an adventurer who can summon the souls of fallen warriors to aid in battle, albeit for a limited time, setting out on a quest for treasure. As a result, you would be able to control 3 characters at once, each with their own unique skills and attacks. Smashworks promised 6 playable heroes at first, with more to come down the line, and the game would feature over 20 dungeons to explore. The Hero Trap just made their funding goal of $25,000 in the campaign's final hours, but sadly for backers, the project ran into financial difficulties and was cancelled in 2016. From what I can see on the game's Kickstarter page, Smashworks were offering refunds, so it could have been much worse for its backers. King of Wushu was a free-to-play multiplayer online battle arena game being developed primarily for the PC, PS4 and Xbox One by Chinese studio Snail Games, with a PS Vita version to follow. It was a follow-up to their earlier title Age of Wushu, a free-to-play martial arts action MMORPG. King of Wushu would be played from a third-person perspective and would feature 15 fighters based on Chinese folklore. Gameplay consisted of 5-on-5 fights wherein players fought to defend a base while simultaneously attacking that of their opponents. The settings and combat were heavily inspired by Chinese culture too, featuring CryEngine generated 3D environments based on Chinese locations and martial arts focused combat. From what I can see, King of Wushu was released in some form in Asia on PC, but the servers were in a right state and it wasn't properly playable. I don't think the PS4 and Xbox One versions ever appeared at all, and the Vita version certainly didn't. Perhaps these server issues were not resolvable because it seems that the game was abandoned altogether. Wonderflick was a gorgeous role-playing game developed by Level 5 for mobile devices. Numerous console releases were planned, including a version for the Vita. They promised cross-platform save data between all versions of the game, which interestingly included the Wii U, PS3 and PS4 and Xbox One. Announced in 2013, it was released for iOS and Android in early 2014. Gameplay consisted of turn-based RPG combat set in a land taken over by monsters, a common theme which we've already seen rear its head in this list. The player character could be customised and equipped with various bits of gear. The game has stunning graphics as you'd expect from a Level 5 game, and character designs were created by designers who'd previously worked on Final Fantasy XIII and Level 5's own Professor Layton series. The name Wonderflick comes from the way the game is played on mobile. The screen shows various medal icons, each corresponding to a different attack, spell or item, and the player flicks these up on the screen to use them in battle. The touchscreen interface seems more suited to the Vita and Wii U, so I'm not sure how that would have worked on the PlayStation and Xbox home console versions. In September 2015, Level 5 announced that they were ending services for Wonderflick and issued refunds for any in-game transaction purchases. When this happened, all the planned console releases were cancelled. A Kickstarter campaign was launched for Colt County in the first half of 2014, but didn't reach its funding goal of £438,000. In fact, it only raised around $35,000, under a tenth of its target. This was being developed by Renegade Kid, known for several handheld games including Zeo Drifter, Moon and a couple of Mutant Mudds games. They've actually appeared in cancelled games before, having been in charge of the cancelled Crash Landed on DS. Colt County was a first-person psychological horror game headed to the PC, Wii U, PS3 and PS4 and Xbox One, as well as of course the Vita, with 360 and 3DS ports as stretch goals. The team described it as The Walking Dead meets Silent Hill 2, having an emphasis on evoking a sense of isolation and loneliness, and it would be released episodically. In other words, it was aiming to be a first-person Silent Hill or Resident Evil horror game, but with a story told in episodes a la the Walking Dead games. There were at least 4 episodes planned, and each episode would have a self-contained storyline with an overarching plot that would span the entire series. The game's protagonist explores a small Texan town in which he's searching for his sister. He soon stumbles across some strange goings-on and some sinister cult activity, hence the game's name. The available demo footage is very bare bones, showing only the engine as the player character walks around the town amid a fierce dust storm holding a wrench. After the Kickstarter campaign fell well short of its goal, Renegade Kid tried to no avail to find a publisher for Colt County and then closed their doors in 2016. It wouldn't be a cancelled Vita Games video without mentioning Bioshock. At 2013's E3, Ken Levine held up a PlayStation Vita and announced that a Bioshock game would be coming to the handheld. Although absolutely nothing on the game has emerged, no gameplay or screenshots, no title, and it's not even known if it was even started, but Ken Levine has stated that he had a Final Fantasy Tactics style game in mind for Bioshock's handheld outing, set in pre-Fall Rapture. A couple of years after the E3 announcement, if one could even call it that, Irrational Games released Bioshock Infinite, which Levine said had caused a huge amount of stress due to the colossal scale of the project and its development. In early 2014 he decided to reduce the studio from around 90 employees down to 15, renaming it Ghost Story Games, and while still under the 2K Games umbrella, would stick to smaller narrative driven projects. The Bioshock franchise has been owned by 2K since 2005, so it was probably their decision to cancel the Vita Bioshock game. As I said, not much to go on, but worthy of a mention. So that was 15 cancelled PlayStation Vita games. As I said at the start, there are an absolute bucket load of other canned Vita games, but these 15 I thought were particularly noteworthy. Let me know in the comments if any of them tickled your fancy. I'll see you on the next episode of Cancelled Games. Yes, there are a couple more at least in the works. And as always, thanks for watching.